Okay, we are live on YouTube.
Alrighty, welcome everybody. It's Thursday, April 3rd. This is House Energy and Digital Infrastructure. We are here today with the Executive Director of the Community Broadband Board, Christine Hallquist, to learn about federal BEAD funding. So we'll go around the room and introduce ourselves, and then we'll turn it over to you for the record. And thanks for being back. My name's Rep. Kathleen James. I am from Manchester. Rep. Campbell's out today.
Rich Bailey from Lamar 2.
Michael Southworth, Caledonia.
Darren Torrey, Washington 2.
Graham Kleppner, Tidman 13, Burlington.
Laura Sibilia, Wyndham 2, and I will disclose that I am on the Vermont Community Broadband Board.
Thank you.
Rebecca Rogak, intern with Chamber of Commerce.
Jack Locker, Committee Assistant.
Rob Fish, Deputy Director of the Vermont Community Broadband Board.
Gwen Zaka, lobbyist for the VCBB. Ellie DeVilliers, Chair of the Vermont CED Association and Executive Director of Maple Broadband.
Rob Yates, Program Director for Vermont Communications Union District Association.
All right, for the record.
And I'm Christine Hallquist, the Executive Director of the Vermont Community Broadband Board, here to talk about the status of BEAD funding and what we see some of our potential threats like. So I will share my screen.
And we have until 9:45. So no
Okay.
rush. Yep.
And hopefully it will go a lot quicker than that, but depends on your questions.
Okay.
Hopefully you give me some good challenging ones. So naturally, I'll kind of start this by saying we don't really, we don't know what's going to happen, just like anything else in federal government. But I can tell you what the latest intel is as of yesterday.
Christine, while you get your, I am taking notes. So I just want folks to know why I'm typing and what I'm doing over here. Sometimes I take notes.
So just a reminder, this program is a very large infrastructure project across the country with $42.5 billion committed to the program. And it is really a nonpartisan effort. If you look, some of the Republican states are suffering with much lower densities than we are in terms of getting to the rural areas. We received a commitment for $229 million. We expected $125 million, but thanks to the work of Vermonters, we were able to get a lot more through our mapping program. It's a competitive program, meaning we have to treat all bidders equally. So if a bidder comes in against a CUD, we have to look at a set of criteria that was really carefully prescribed by the federal government working with us. Although we do think the CUDs are going to be very competitive. This program covers both on and off-grid addresses. If you look at Act 71, that was focused on wireline or connected addresses. But this program also says we need to address off-grid addresses with reliable technology. Now, reliable as defined by the legislature is 100 over 100 megabits per second up and down, which is really can only be achieved by fiber. Reliability as defined by the federal government is 100 over 20, which cable can achieve those and some wireless can achieve those. The funds must address all unserved addresses, although when we talk about unserved addresses, part of this mapping challenge we had is, we're not going to serve a hunting camp. If you look at some of the addresses on the maps, some of them are even can be hay bales at times. So we've really done a lot of ground truthing on the maps with the help of Vermonters in order to target exactly where those addresses are. In fact, when we're sitting down and looking at maps, I'm even sitting meetings, we're leaving to look at that little blue dot out there and say, what is that blue dot and how are we going to serve it? So we're down to singling out every single address and how we get to it.
Yeah.
Christine, can you just remind us what unserved and underserved means? It's speeds, right?
Yeah, I would say, from my perspective, if you're underserved by the definition that the legislators legislation set up years ago, you really are unserved. I mean, with what needs to be done today, but the legislature defined underserved as anything below 25 downlink, 3 megabits uplink, and then unserved was 4/1, 4 megabits download, 1 megabit upload. But if you look at what we're trying to do today with video technology, even 25/3, I'm sure you've observed it with people on your Zoom. Even 25/3 today is not effective in terms of being able to carry out business.
Sorry, so what's by the federal BEAD definition, unserved is what? Less than
100
over 20. Okay.
And what is that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Technology. Can you remind us what that technology is? 100/20?
That's cable. Generally, cable can get to 120. So I want to be careful about that because cable has limitations. And that's the reason the legislature set a fiber preference and reason the majority, I would say almost all of the states have a fiber preference because cable is limited in its capacity. If you look at, the fiber the size of a human hair, it has 30,000 times the capacity of cable. So if you look at taxpayer investments over time, fiber is clearly the winner. In fact, when you look at the cost if you look at what 45-year lifetime costs, fiber is about 10% of the lifetime cost of even its nearest competitor. So if you look at Starlink and wireless, those have 5-year lifespans when they have to get upgraded with hardware all the time. So from a responsibility of taxpayer investment, fiber is the best investment. And if you get down to the cost per gigabyte, it just wipes all those out. You can't even compare. So it was a very responsible decision the legislature made to establish fiber as a preference. So the plan is that 100% of Vermont residents will have access to reliable broadband. And what we've done, so where we are in terms of the BEAD process today, we've spent several years, and you'll, if you read the national news, it's been 3 years of design of this program, and we're really at the 1 yard line. We were very excited to be at this point, which I'll get to the punchline in a minute. But and we're at the point where we have we've done what's called a pre-qualification bid, where we had all the bidders come in and say how much it's going to cost. Are you going to be able to get to every address? And we're indeed have the money to get to 100% of the addresses, and we'll get to, and that includes off-grid. And 95% of our addresses, greater than 95%, will have access to fiber broadband. So we're really, in terms of country, we would be leading the country in the fact that we have the adequate funds to do this. In fact, because of the involvement of Vermonters, we got about 4 times the per capita amount of federal funding that the other states did on an average basis. So now we get to the punchline. With any changes to this program, it'll be a minimum of an 18-month delay. And the reason for that is because, as you heard before, we spent 3 years planning for this. We started a year and a half ago developing the bidding process and the criteria. We publicized the criteria. We've had all these companies come in and bid, and essentially under a set of terms. If things change, then we have to go back to the beginning and start over with the RFQ, the time, the public, the public waiting periods and all the things that go with that. So it's really critical that we continue on the path we're on. Now there's a lot of speculation going on. Howard Lutnick, who is who appointed to the head of the Department of Commerce, basically is, been talking about advocating for what's called a tech neutral approach. And we have to be careful with what those words mean, because this is what could set us back, and this would be a disservice to Vermonters in all rural America. If you look what happened, Starlink is the problem here. If you look what's happened, the state broadband leaders, we have a network. I work closely with the 50 state broadband leaders as well as 6 territorial leaders. We've all been approached by Starlink. And it really, they came to Vermont twice to say, use our technology. And we say it's not a reliable technology. The NTI, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, said it's not a reliable technology. And I can explain in detail why it's not a reliable technology. I'll just make 2 points. I'll make 2 points about it not being reliable technology. It requires a radio uplink. And radio, just like cable, radio even has less capacity than cable. So putting a radio uplink to these satellites is where the constraint is in terms of capacity. Secondly, it doesn't work during large, storms, rain. It's heavy, raining heavy or snowing heavy. You lose your signal. I run Starlink for 3 years before I got fiber, and I set up a system to have backup, so that when the Starlink failed, it would fail over to other systems. But it's not a reliable technology. It's it's a law of physics.
And if I might add a third reason that it's not a reliable technology, that's under the control of a single individual who has behaved erratically.
Oh, yeah. And I'll add a fourth reason. I've met with General Knight, our Adjutant General, twice now. There are 37 Adjutant Generals who signed a letter to the Department of Defense. It's called the National Integration of Time for the Resiliences of Operations, called NITRO. We right now, our defense system is depending on satellites, and satellites can be easily taken out. So they're demanding a secure fiber network, but they're not being heard by the Department of Defense. So if you're worried about defense, so everything adds up to the fact that we should not be depending on a satellite system.
I'd like to just pile on and say that when we were developing Act 79, Starlink refused to testify in open session about participating in that project. And so, despite heavy lobbying to be named.
So the wrinkle here is Starlink was lobbying the states. They were lobbying Congress. Well, they stopped when Trump got elected. They stopped lobbying. And this is where we're seeing, we have met with, so that the U.S. House Commerce Committee was doing a hearing on BEAD. We sent a letter, entered in a congressional record. We met with the Democratic delegation, and we met with last week with the attorney for the Republican side, the Republican majority, and still getting this consistent message. But I don't want you to have any confidence, because you're all following what's going on. That's where the status now is. We're keeping our nose to the grindstone. We're not delaying at all. We're finishing we're finished taking all the formal bids by April 17th, and by June we'll select the final bidders. So we're really on track to get in the original plan to get funding by the end of the year. And we've sent this message out. This is the exact message letter that we sent Howard Lutnick. Provide maximum flexibility and autonomy. States should have the authority to choose what technology is appropriate. Like I said before, we're down to the blue dot. That blue dot that may not get fiber, we want to serve with the best technology. It could be radio, it could be fixed wireless. It could be using the last couple thousand feet of their copper line, or it could be satellite. But we want the flexibility to do what's best for each address, and we are going to do that. We're happy to see the program get accelerated, and we're happy to see the approval process get streamlined. but the key here is leave it to the states and don't force us to change our fiber preference. So another danger to this thing is what's called the extremely high cost location threshold. There's some discussion saying if we change that threshold and we make it mandatory for each state, that's another way that Starlink could creep into this. So if you look at the extremely high cost per location threshold is a very powerful tool for us, because what we do is we take each bid area, we look at what it should cost, and then we say if it costs over this amount, then we'll seek an alternate technology. In other words, we're not going to spend $100,000 to go up somebody's 3-mile driveway to get fiber. It'll make more sense maybe to do this with what they call a direct dish, a direct radio dish, which still can get 1 gig, but it's good. You look at $100,000 solution versus a couple $1,000 solution. So we set the high cost threshold for each bid area, and then when it's over that, we look for an alternate technology. There's been some discussion about setting that threshold at a federal level with this peanut butter approach for all states, which could result if that level was set too low. For example, if they set it at $5,000, that would automatically force Starlink to be the solution. So we're watching carefully about what happens with that extremely high cost location threshold number. And of course, it does make sense to set a cap, because if you look at some of the states, like Nevada, they're very expensive, and maybe a fixed wireless solution will work better in many areas there because there's many flat areas in Nevada that could be achieved at through wireless. We have problems because of our mountains and our leaves. So again, leave it to the states to determine what's the best solution. So we're in constant communication. We're staying very close. We have really good relationships with all the other states. We have a very tight state broadband leaders network. We've submitted a letter to the congressional record, which has been reported in the congressional record. We've met with a senior counsel. We've testified. We've briefed the governor and the governor's staff. So we're doing everything we can to stay on top of the situation. I'm here to tell you, it's not a red light; it's a yellow light. We're proceeding with care and caution, but have not seen anything yet that indicates that this program is going to change.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Questions? Yeah, Rep. Sibilia?
So if the extremely high cost amount is lowered dramatically, basically facilitating all of those funds going to Starlink, what are the options here in Vermont?
Well, I think the answer that I give you for the options in Vermont, it becomes much more urgent to have a consumer protection bill in place if that happens. I would say it's urgent anyway to have a consumer protection bill, because telecom being I'm here to tell you telecom is even more important than electricity right now, because you need telecom to store your electricity. So that this idea that you never know what you're going to get for speeds leaves us exposed. If Starlink comes along, we really need to monitor closely what's happening with speeds, because we know the technology can't achieve what we need. We have developed a software and a public site. We're in final testing of that, where we can show the speeds that are happening all across the state with every ISP. So we have that capacity. We develop that capacity. So I would encourage the legislature to be thinking about those consumer protections, especially if Starlink comes along.
And so if that were to happen, it's possible that the VCBB could facilitate $250 million going to Starlink? Or some set of millions going to Starlink? Like, do we have any choice?
No, we don't have any choice. If we have one choice, we could say no to the money. But, it's, I would say Starlink is better than nothing.
I don't know that I would agree with you, actually. Because of the erratic behavior of the owner of that company and, what we've seen in other places, threats to shut it off. So,
Yeah, that's certainly your call.
So to boil down what I think I've heard, right now, yellow light, who knows? Any changes to the program could trigger up to minimum 18-month delays in getting the money out the door because we'd have to redesign the program. And if it's amended at the federal level to include this tech neutral thing, which means you have to include Starlink, our choices at that point would be to turn down the money or to include Starlink.
Yeah, I would say that's a good summary.
Did I miss anything important?
I actually think it's clarification. So I think we are tech neutral in Vermont, our plan. But it's at the state's discretion as opposed to federally.
Well, I think that's good. You make a good point.
I don't understand
I want to
that.
reiterate.
Yeah.
I'll answer that. That was a good point of our representative. We have done a tech neutral approach. The Act 71 didn't specify technology. It said anything that can achieve 100 over 100. And the cable systems in some of the more urban areas are able to do that. And the wireless in some of the urban areas are able to do it. So we are a tech neutral approach. We just defined a higher bar. So what happens is if the state has set a higher bar than the federal government in terms of performance.
And the tech neutral, that's already been, Lutnick's already said it has to be tech neutral. So that's already happened, right? Or am I incorrect to that? No, I'm incorrect, excuse me.
No, he hasn't stepped in on this. His thinking is it should be tech neutral. But nothing has changed from the direction we received.
But that's not where we get into trouble. Where we get into trouble is
By defining higher standards?
Extremely high cost
Because-
definition.
Well, because I would challenge that that Starlink would not even achieve the 100 over 20
right.
reliable. So that's an interesting point. So even tech neutral, the inference is Starlink can achieve that. I would go to the next level and challenge that. Say, no, it can't achieve that. We know it can't achieve that.
The technology question. Can you elaborate on the wireless internet in terms of its the requirements to get that in terms of line of sight and distances, and are you familiar with all the little details?
Yes,
Is it
yes.
10 miles of direct line?
You actually can't define mileage in Vermont. If you were in a clear open plain
Right.
in the Midwest, in the desert, for example, you could do something like that. But in Vermont, because we have, in fact, even in the Sierras, the penetration is better than Vermont. Vermont, we have this thing called deciduous trees that have big leaves, and these leaves have water in them, which water blocks radio frequency. So we have, if you look at getting over a hill, you can't go through the hills with RF. So if you put a antenna on top of a mountain, the problem, if there's a hill in the way as it goes down, it's not going to get through. So you can't get through the hills, and you lose performance through the vegetation. So if a tower, for example, in Hardwick, you could get reliable maybe for a mile to a mile and a half. And then the other part of radio is, again, it's limited in terms of its bandwidth. Just like I talked about fiber having 30,000 times the amount of capacity cable. radio is the same way. So as more people get on it, your performance drops.
And you can't get universal service. I would just jump in and say with wireless.
Yeah, I'll give you a great example. I used to take the wireless providers that come and try to sell their wares and say, show me the solution for Belvedere, Vermont. And they would open up their computer and they would, fancy programs. You say, oh, I can't get there. Thank you. And then they would never call again.
So there's a very small percentage of households could get it reliably.
Well, I wouldn't say that either, because the urban areas, for example, Burlington, there's 5G, like actually right here, I went on the 5G network versus using the wireless here because I'm using my tethering on my phone to the AT&T signal because it's so much better than the wireless you have here in the house.
We need some digital infrastructure people to work.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rep. Bailey?
So a couple of questions. Where is the $229 million sitting right at the moment?
It's sitting. We don't have it in the bank. So what we do is we have to, and we're doing this weekly now. We have to do what's called a drawdown, based on what we've spent in the invoices. We have a commitment, and then we do regular drawdowns. And we were doing those drawdowns monthly, but now we're doing them weekly.
And other communities are coming.
But at this point, those drawdowns are supporting your planning process and the bidding process and, okay.
That's right.
So what starts, would you say, April? You're looking for response to bids.
That's right.
So you can start deploying fiber? And where are we going to be deploying it?
So we have an open bidding process that closes April 17th. Then we spend evaluating the bids and working with the bidders. We still have to work with the bidders to make sure they have solid business plans and solid technical plans. So we're going to do an evaluation, and then by June we will come out with an award to the bidders with what their plans are and submit that to the federal government. Then the federal government takes several months to evaluate, about 6 months to evaluate and come back to us because it has to go through the NTIA, and then the ITIA, once they approve it, it goes to the another agency. What is it? NESC?
Yes.
NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, but then to evaluate it. Then it comes back to us.
And are the local CUDs are going to oversee that? Oversee the deployment?
Assuming they win the bid. So the way this works is we've divided the state into many bidding areas, and the providers bid on those areas, and then we evaluate them on their ability to serve the area as well as the cost. Now the CUDs are serving some of the least dense area, the least interesting areas, so they're likely to be the winning bid.
Yeah, I know we'll hear from the CUDs next. I'd like to learn a little bit more about that too. Like who are all who's all bidding on this and who's gonna, who's gonna carry out the actual work.
Well, the bidders I'm being careful because
right.
Yeah, could range anywhere from Fidium Consolidated to Comcast, as well as smaller ones like Stowe and Mount Mansfield and others. So it just all of the range of ISPs in the state could be bidding on this.
It's an open bidding process.
Open bidding process.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So you mentioned too that there could be permitting reform and changes to the approval process that would speed things up on the federal level. Would that affect the stage? Or is that something that is?
Well, we're required to comply with these national permitting programs, and the majority of our fiber is being running on existing utility lines. So if you look, many of the states, probably most of the states, it's actually cheaper to go underground For us, it's significantly more expensive because we have these old rocks to go through. So turns out most of our electrical distribution is on overhead anyhow in the rural areas. So we just don't have the same permitting benefits. So there's this extensive permitting process, an approval process you have to go through to make sure you're not, hitting endangered species or crossing other protected lands. And we just don't have that problem because those are all we have there.
So back to Rep. Bailey's question, it sounds like deployment early next year. If things
That's the plan.
if things go on the normal timeline.
Yep, normal timeline, we would be in construction next year.
So another question is if, and I'm not quite sure how this would work, but if GMP is putting multiple lines underground, can you partner with them?
Yes,
Run your cable at the same time and can it be, I don't know, they can be side by side or they have to be I'm not, that's irrelevant question. So,
well, it's an excellent question because that's what we're making sure happens. Because once the real cost is open the trench up. Once that
Right.
trench is open, it's simply putting a conduit in and another conduit, but if you have to go back and do it.
well, that's good. I like looking at that option. Thank you.
They putting a conduit in for you, or
No, we would pay for our own conduit.
you're putting, if Green Mountain Power is converting to underground, you're putting a conduit in,
Yes.
and are the other telephone communication people putting them in,
I don't know. Yeah. It would,
Fidium or
Fidium, right.
Consolidated or whatever the other 17 is.
They're coming in today.
Yeah, I would ask you a question.
So you're putting in a conduit at this time. When Green Mountain Power puts a line in, you're putting an empty conduit in,
Well, we're saying you should put an empty conduit,
but you are not then.
but yeah, we don't do the construction, so
Is a conduit being put in your interest?
that's what we're encouraging to happen.
But if there's a vacant conduit in that trench and somebody else comes along, they can occupy that conduit.
The person who pays for the conduit owns the conduit. So it requires, so the ISP, if they have an interest in serving, I would recommend they put the conduit in. And then if they own the conduit, so someone else couldn't come along and use that conduit.
And has that been a recent change?
It's not a mandate. It's not a mandate. We have no mandates at this point.
I think we have some folks who can answer the question.
So
For the record,
Yeah, for the record, so Rob Beatty from Vicuda, we've had great conversations with Vicuda, with Green Mountain Power over the last 2 years about this. And I think Christine's accurately representing that there is no statewide uniform approach to this, but our understanding and what we've observed is GMP has been placing their electrical conduit down low. They put some fill in over it. They put a second conduit in over it, and they've left that stubbed up and ready for a communications provider to use, but they're paying for it. And so as the CUDs have gone on to similar routes, some of the CUDs have coordinated with them to take advantage of that. But it's not a one size fits all. They're not always building where we're building. It's much more of where the opportunities match and we see their conduit there. We go to them and say, hey, can we work with it? And they've been very collaborative about that.
Which actually makes sense because it's cost savings for everyone.
Yeah, it's
I think the collaboration is there, but it's not the maps don't exactly match and the routes don't exactly match. And so they are getting ahead of it in a very positive way, and we're working with them where we can.
When I put conduit underground for Central Vermont Public Service, and we put in a spare conduit, if you weren't using it, there was something in there that somebody else could come in and use it. So if we put in a spare conduit so that we could pull another conductor if one failed in a line, somebody else could come along and take that conduit. Now, whether you want to put enough, you can put communication cables together. So you put three companies' communication cables in a single conduit. You can't put it in a power conduit. But whether you have to pull out the existing conduit so you can pull it in three simultaneously or whatever is a situation.
Yep.
And you still have the separation requirement. So here got the 20 or 30 inch separation between the power and the communications. And it's communication space, just like communication space.
Thank you. Yep.
Rick Bailey?
So do you think GMP is gonna charge rental fees for that conduit? Since when they own it, or?
I think I think that's a great question for them. What I would say is they've been very collaborative and, we've been working with them for, so one of the CVs I think has actually done a pilot. I don't know the details of how it worked out.
We have,
I can answer that as well.
well, you guys are coming on at 9:45, so maybe we could wrap up with, Executive Director Hallquist, and then we'll
Yeah.
bring these guys up and we're moving to the next. So yeah,
Just one other quick one. So you haven't heard back from your letter to the Department of Commerce yet. You said you sent them a letter?
Yeah, no, we have not heard back.
Okay.
How many states are in the position that we're in?
Well, I would say 47. 3 of the states have already completed their process and are waiting instruction, and they've been put on hold.
We've done a lot of company.
I feel bad. I have to return to this one more time. I am still trying to wrap my head around we talked a little bit about a choice that Vermont would face, which certainly seems like a devil's bargain about turning down the money. If such and such happens, like taking the money and going with the new federal standards or turning down the money if X. And I was very focused on the tech neutral thing. I thought that was the X, but it sounds like that's not the X. So what? I'm sorry, we have to go back to this again. Did it have to do with the extremely high?
Yes.
Can you just, I'm really sorry. Walk me through that one more time.
Okay.
What would potentially change at the federal level that would put us in this horrible position?
So if the Fed, again, this goes back to why we say leave it to the states.
Yeah.
If the federal government defines an extremely high cost location, meaning that if you exceed the cost, this dollar threshold, you have to go to an alternate technology for fiber. If they set, if let's just say that, there might be some evil, an evil person trying to do this, what they would do is set that cost so low that it would force a certain technology to happen, right? So for example, if it's set for $5,000, the only technology that would achieve that introductory cost would be low Earth orbit satellite. And then of course, low Earth, that has a whole bunch of other implications, which means, right now, my last Starlink bill was $129 a month, right? Now I will tell you that I would rather have Starlink than nothing as a consumer, right? You may not trust, you do a deal with the devil if you're trying to be in a rural area, trying to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
Not saying that Starlink's developed.
So they could say at some low cost, you have to use alternative technology as an option, or you must use the cheaper thing.
No, you wouldn't use a cheaper thing. It doesn't say you could, for example, address it with a wireless solution, which might work great for somebody in the Midwest who lives in a flat area, but for Vermont, that doesn't work because we've already kind of got to all the areas we could with wireless.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, whoever is saying, I'm typing, whoever is raising hands, go ahead.
Hi, Rob Fish, the Deputy Director.
Hi, Rob.
Hello. One thing that I think is useful to clarify is the extremely high cost threshold. That is the amount of the federal contribution.
That is what the feds say they would put towards an address. So the only other opportunity would be to further subsidize applications for fiber in some way. But we fully understand that the needs of the state right now are, let's say there's just a little bit of competition right now that's fully understandable, but that's is one option. But I wanted to clarify that it is just the federal contribution.
Well, that makes a big difference in my understanding, because if they're going to say, if they're going to say in these extremely high cost locations, do whatever you want to, but we're only going to chip in X, then the choice we make is we either go with X or we burn through a lot of our money subsidizing the cost of fiber over a satellite because we prefer fiber. Did I sort of get that right?
Or, sorry, Ellie usually is included on the record, or the bidder covers the difference.
Or the bidder covers, okay, either way.
But there's a difference to be covered.
Either way, we'd be making a choice. We would have to say, gosh, we think it's worth an extra $100,000. Okay.
Yeah, well, yeah,
Okay.
I'm making the assumption that you're not gonna give, with all the issues you're facing.
Right.
You're, coming up with 100 million plus. It's probably not something you would be able to do. So I made a whole bunch of assumptions here.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah. And also you've got to have a solid business case. So that now you get into the issue of what the level was set. So for example, we're looking at a number that, say for example, we were looking at a number of $10,000 per location. If the Fed set it at 9,000, we could probably pull it off with a business case. But if
we're using hypotheticals.
No, I'm with you now.
Yeah.
I was missing a key piece of the equation in my mind.
Yeah, thank you.
What is the average cost to wire a house with fiber in Vermont, the remaining houses? Do you have any idea?
I do, but I'd rather not say publicly. Because we're in a bidding process, yeah.
Okay. Thanks for bearing with me. Yeah.
Just one more. So Christine, you were also saying there was a possibility on these really far distant ones to do a dish, Wi-Fi line of sight, or did I?
Direct radio.
So I want to be very clear. There are no ubiquitous solutions. There's nothing works for all. What I'm saying is for each location, there's a variety of options. We know that the existing copper line up to 2,500 feet can give you 1 gig service, can give you this performance. We know that what are called ubiquitous dishes, direct line of sight relay dishes can provide that level of service. So there's other alternatives. Depending on how many houses are close together, you could do omnivorous, whatever wireless. So what I'm saying is we're looking at each location saying what's the best, lowest cost solution for that location. Well, yeah.
You chose this wireless solution and you're at the base of a mountain road. You put in the initial connection to fiber, the radio transmits to another radio. You put repeaters down up the valley or up the and go out to the side. So basically the limitation is at the trunk, at the first connection. If all these other branches are coming in from the side roads, line of sight, if you can't get from one antenna to the customer, you put a repeater in.
Yep.
So you go out the branch. So there's the limitations is at the trunk.
Yeah. Your capacity constraint.
Capacity constraint is right there.
Yep. You got it.
All right. Why don't we swap out seats? Executive Director Hallquist, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, really appreciate it.
Yeah. I enjoyed the discussion. Thank you.
Oh, great. As did I always learn a lot. So thank you. Yeah, sorry for the repeat questions.
Oh, that was great. It shows you're trying to understand.
Yeah, well, I'm a boiler downer too. Until I can boil it down myself in my own mind, Very tedious, I'm
You
sure.
want the comfy chair? You want? No, there.
I'll take the hard one.
Okay, thank you for being here for the record.
Rob Bietzke, Program Director for Vermont Communication Districts Association.
And Ellie DeVilliers, Chair of Vermont Communications Union District Association.
So we have 2 slides for you, and we wanted to start up with a little bit of background on. We'll wait for them up. Just want to start out with a little bit of background, actually reshare some slides that we shared at the beginning of the session that kind of set the groundwork about who we are and what the missions that we believe we're focusing on is. And then we'll focus in the 4 key things that we're watching from the beach perspective for most of the presentation. Okay, so you guys ready? You want me to start with paper or?
Whatever.
You working on pulling this up, Jake?
What? I sent you the Zoom link.
A Zoom link. Thank you.
So
Sorry.
you'll be able
Missed
to
that.
share the screen.
Yeah, whatever works for you. And thanks for starting with the background. That's always helpful for us.
Perhaps while he's doing that, I can answer the question that we were touching on when Christine was up around Green Mountain Power. So, obviously I'm the executive director of one of the communications union districts. So we've had some direct conversations with GMP around this exact issue. And in our case, at least, there's been a coordination and flexibility in terms of options. So we have a project we're working on with them right now where they're opening the trench, they're bearing all that costs, and then they're giving us the ability at our cost and expense to pay to put in conduit, which we then own. So just wanted to make sure that's clear as well. I think we have had conversations in the computer level, but they've been very flexible to options.
Yeah, so in some places they're using a trenching machine that does it automatically. In other places they're opening a trench and letting us put conduit. It's not one size fits all. Okay, I think we're ready to go here. Sorry about that. Just communication.
We have until 10:30, so.
Great. Okay, so just as a reminder, BCUDA is the Association of the CUDs. There are 9 CUDs that participate in various ways in the programs across the state. 8 of them are members of BCUDA. So we are municipalities. We are publicly owned entities. The infrastructure that's developed through the grants and self-funding is owned by these municipalities and governed by representatives of each of the towns that are appointed or elected to serve on that. We operate under public-private partnerships. So the infrastructure is publicly owned and has a long-term governance structure through the public. But most of the CUDs have a private partner who is an expert in telecommunications and runs broadband networks in other places that actually do the operations, and in some cases, the billing, customer interface, and other things like that. That varies slightly between CUDs. We're obviously public organizations, so we're accountable and transparent. And obviously, the governing boards have a very integral role in helping to set rates for consumers in Vermont, and also for helping to do things like decide whether we take on debt or whether we pursue a grant or other things like that. I think that's it. Any questions just kind of on who we are? We'll just breeze over this and keep going. So the goal, the mission that we're on is to deliver world-class broadband by fiber to the premise to every address in Vermont that has been unserved or underserved and beyond. I mean, in addition to those addresses that have never been served before with quality broadband, we'd like to be part of the broader solution for world-class broadband statewide. And we define that as 100-100. That's the goal that the legislature set. Most of the networks we're building will easily do a gigabit and 10 gigabits and beyond on the fibers that are being deployed to the homes. Very future-proof technology. We're making an investment using the ARPA funds, the self-funding in some cases of municipal revenue bonds, and hopefully BEAD to get this very long-term infrastructure with very high capacity in place to every end. Fiber, I think as Christine said, is really the only technology that is certain to deliver this. It just does away with things like, is there sleet or snow coming down between you and the transmission tower? What's the distance? Are there leaves on the trees? And all those things that affect wireless and satellite. Any questions on that? We're going to get to the BEAD part. One other thing, just in terms of progress, so we're very focused on BEAD right now because that's what's in front of us. But there's been enormous progress over the last 4 years. Obviously, the pandemic helped spur this, but there were 64,000 unserved addresses in Vermont in 2021. We were down to 40,000 in 2023, and the BEAD target, I believe, was less than 20,000 remaining. So 2/3 of the problem's been solved in the last 3 years. The program is working. It is successful. We have happy customers and viable business models in the cities that are out there doing this. So program's working. It's really, we were hoping we would already be into BEAD construction by now. The idea of waiting till January of next year, let alone potentially delaying that further, is unfortunate because the crews are out there, they are building this stuff, and we are in a position to finish this job in the next couple of years. Okay, so BEAD program update. Maybe I'll do one more and then Ellie's going to do the rest. So as Christine and Rob mentioned, $42.5 billion in federal program preference in the initial version from the prior administration for long-term infrastructure. It is part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It is not part of the Install Temporary Services Act. It was an infrastructure program intended to build long-term infrastructure. And, part of the reason it took so long to roll it out was because they were trying to avoid the problems of the subsidy programs that other federal agencies have run in broadband over the last 10 years. And so a very prescriptive set of rules that Congress wrote and asked the states to implement at the state level to come up with a program that didn't make the same mistakes, that, created a good competitive process, looked at, are we really building infrastructure, et cetera. So while we're not happy with how long it has taken, certainly understand how long it's taken, and it's not a bad program in the way it was designed. So the law required each state to set up a broadband office and to come up with these programs, which BCBB has been doing. It required an initial filing of how they would approach the problem, and then it required them to later file a plan of how they would implement this bidding process. That was called Volume 2. It's a 120 some odd page prescriptive thing of how they're going to run the program they're currently in. That Volume 2 is the thing that took us all that time to get approved. And that now we're questioning, are we going to have to reopen that and go through the process of recreating the rules for a new program? So all states completed that planning process by January of 2025 before the administration change. 3 of them, as Christine mentioned, actually got through the bidding process and made awards. I know 2 of them, at least, Louisiana and Nevada, and I forget the third one, where they missed the step that NIST had to release the money to them. They thought they could get the money released and get started before things happen. And so they're really in turmoil right now in terms of the delay process. And I have the same quote that Christine had up here. Secretary Lutnick said he was going to, in a letter, it's not actually from the NTIA yet, but he's going to conduct a rigorous review of BEAD program. The department is ripping out Biden administration's pointless requirements, revamping BEAD program to take a tech neutral approach that is rigorously driven by outcomes so the states can provide internet access that will be possible. So there are 4 things that we want to talk to you about, and I'm going to switch to Ellie, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you. And before I get into this, thank you, Rob. That's been great. I just wanted to spend a little bit more time on this subject of BEAD as an infrastructure program, because that's really fundamentally important. I mean, the Biden administration even referred to it as Internet for All. That was their intent, is to have this be. This is a once in a lifetime kind of infrastructure program that was intended to serve the unserved and underserved one time, finally solve the problem once and for all. Hence, exactly as Rob said, all of the one might even consider it overly prescriptive micromanagement from the NTIA, from the Biden NTIA, but that was, you can understand it when you understand where they were coming from. And I think that there is a difference between positioning this as an infrastructure program. There's a difference between infrastructure and getting something like fiber out, not necessarily to the last house if it's really far away, but out into the rural areas, because infrastructure enables a lot more than just broadband. It's connecting communities to each other and to central locations. And it's also one of the challenges that we have is we have in our rural areas, we have aging and failing DSL infrastructure. And so it's important not only to get people broadband, but also to get people emergency services like E911. So I think that when you read something like Lethnick saying we're trying to make sure we get broadband to everyone, it's a little bit of a subtle but important shifting of the goalposts from how this program was originally intentioned as a bipartisan infrastructure bill for rural America into now a connecting all houses program, right? And it's really important to make sure that fundamentally we remember that the original intent here was to provide infrastructure, put in terrestrial infrastructure, have investments in our states and our rural areas, and not investing in space, where again, there's already existing satellites up there. That investment is already there. So the focusing on having the money go into rural America that has been unserved and underserved, and there is a divide. And the longer that we persist with those areas not having proper broadband, the longer that divide will be out there. So just want to introduce that. So you want to add?
Our friend, Krista from NEK actually coined this yesterday, and we're all going to use it.
Yes.
We want infrastructure in Vermont, not in space.
Yes. There you
And that's kind of the choice you're making is, are we going to invest in more satellites? And more satellites and more satellites, or are we going to invest in infrastructure here on the ground in Vermont?
Yeah, and we did touch on it as well a little bit earlier with prior testimony, but we have to remember this is a federal program, and the federal government does have discretion. Statute allows the assistant secretary a wide latitude for rule changes, and again, some of the rule changes are more dramatic than others and would set the clock back, and hopefully that doesn't happen. But I think the thing we need to understand is the VCBB is the state broadband office. There are program rules that are not up to us, and there's things going on in Washington, D.C. that are not within our control or even necessarily our influence. And so at the end of the day, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. And the broadband office has choices it can make that are within its ability and authority to make. There's potentially choices that the state could make. And then as bidders, there's choices that bidders can make, right? And again, we're in the middle of a competitive bid process. So I won't get into the specifics of any potential bids, but just to note that there are different players in this. And in particular, there's actions of bidders into the program and there's actions of the broadband office. And so it's important to acknowledge that when we talk about we, the we or the players that are trying to get to the outcome that supports Vermont strategy may be different. And some players may have more and less flexibility than others. Is that all clear before I move on?
Just again, a pretty basic question. Sorry if I missed this. So there are the bidders or the grant applications, and I know you can't talk about it, but would they be primarily coming from CUDs and then they have ISP partners they're going to be working with, or would they be primarily coming from ISP providers?
So it's a mix of everything. It's a competitive program.
All over the place.
So as Director Hallquist said, for example, it's a matter of public record that my CUD is planning to participate in this program, although I can't get into the nature of specifics of our bid. But there's a project area, there's other ISPs that are in that project area. I have no idea if any of those have put in the pre-application period to express interest. Quite possibly there are.
Oh, okay.
But it's an open and competitive process. So we'll put in a bid, others may put in a bid, it will be scored, a winner will be picked, and then from there, the VCBB will negotiate with the winner on the final details.
Are the ISP areas or the CUDs, are they like a franchise territory? Defined where
A non-exclusive.
Yeah.
well, somebody was in earlier about even if you're there, it's competitive that another company can come down and provide the service by any means available. But for this bidding process, a contractor could build a product line, a fiber optic from A to B, and then put it up for sale to an ISP to. I mean, they've alluded that the bidders could be anything, anybody in the universe that can build a product.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, obviously we have others who can answer this in more detail if needed, but conceptually there's a number of, it's open to all potential bidders. However, there are requirements, and one of the requirements is you have to have a sustainable business plan. So it's not necessarily likely that you're going to have a construction company that's going to put in to say, we're going to build this thing and then flip it,
Speculation.
because that probably wouldn't meet the gating criteria for being a sustainable business.
But to your question, I mean, the basic protections in the program is a period of interest, federal period of interest. I think it's 10 years.
10 years.
There's certainly some effort to extend that, but so there is a federal interest in any awarded project. But yes, a private company could sell the asset or get rolled up to another company a little bit later on. Obviously, the CUDs as public entities do not have the ability to do that in the same
Or the desire.
for the desire.
All right, so I'm going to go on and talk about these potential BEAD changes in Vermont. So they're summarized here. So the first one is potential reductions in permitting, workforce selection, and other of these Biden administration's so-called onerous requirements. These were things that were not in statutes, but that supported policy goals of the Biden administration. Potential elimination of fiber preference, which we have talked about pretty extensively. Potential implementation of a per address cap, which we've also talked about, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail. And then the final implication here is potential delays in completing Vermont's Act 71 strategy, which is universal fiber service across the states. Slide. Okay. So, so reduction in permitting, workforce selection, other onerous requirements. So, again, this is a list here of some of the kinds of requirements that were not in the statute that were in the notice of funding opportunity issued under the Biden NTIA. And a number of these have been relatively comprehensively attacked, certainly from certain parties, as being not necessary. And even the outgoing former head of the NTIA said that these weren't really core to the program. So a number of these are probably fairly likely to go away. And so many of these changes would either be neutral or positive for CUDs. Like, for example, the letter of credit and performance bond. This is a requirement where if that went away, I don't think anyone would shed any tears because it simply adds a layer of cost and complexity to the project. And things like, for example, climate change and climate resilience, those are things that these building fiber network, you're doing those things anyway. And there's best practices for making sure that we're paying prevailing wage anyway. So it's not forcing us to document and make sure that the federal government is aware of what we're doing. Doesn't really fundamentally change the facts on the ground. And again, just adds red tape and cost and complexity and time. And the permitting is actually a really big one that Director Hallquist mentioned. But the way that the permitting is envisioned under the current system is not only onerous, but a little bit unreasonable in that you must have every single permit for everything before you start anything, which doesn't even make any sense over projects that could take 2 to 4 years because permits don't even last that long. So this is a well-known issue, working with the broadband office on this. And so that's one of the ones where we're really hoping that some of these simplifications actually do come to pass because they'll streamline and lower costs and speed deployment. So that's on the good side. Now, we've talked about this potential elimination of the fiber preference. I don't think we need to go into this in any more detail now, unless you guys have further questions that have occurred to you in the last little bit as we've been talking. All right, we can also come back to it. So this is kind of the core of the issue from the CUD or Bermuda standpoint, is this potential per address cap, which would be implemented through that extremely high cost per location threshold that someone wasn't thinking too much when they came up with that name. And so this is a way of just visually describing what we've been talking about, that conceptually you have a project cost to build with fiber what you're going to do. And again, there are some addresses that are off the beaten path that would be considered with alternate technologies as part of the negotiating process. But because it's no one wants to spend $100,000 or $1 million building fiber to the middle of nowhere, right? That doesn't really make sense. So there is flexibility already envisioned in the program in terms of how that will work to make sure that that scenario doesn't happen. But conceptually, of the things that one would actually wish to connect with fiber, there is a project cost, and the BEAD program has a statutory 25% match requirement. So again, as a minimum match requirement. So as a concept, it's 75 cents on the dollar, 25 cents are brought by the bidder, 75 cents is available from the federal government in the form of this grant. If there is a cap put on the amount allowed per address through that extremely high cost per location threshold, then now what happens is from a bidder perspective, you have your project cost is, for the sake of argument, it's $10 million. And now instead of getting 75 cents of the dollar, you can get 60 cents or 50 cents or 40 cents. And as a bidder, you have to decide, well, what does that mean? Am I out? Or can I come up with some more money at an acceptable interest rate such that my business case still works so that I'm not losing whatever is available? Because, rather get 40 cents than 0 cents. If you're sitting here saying, this is our mission and we have a universal service obligation, we will get fiber to these areas. So this is really the challenge we're sitting with right now is we don't know if this is going to happen. Having said that, we're extremely concerned that it might happen. And so we're doing everything in our power to have conversations as widely and broadly as we can to try and figure out if this happens, what would we do? How would we fill that gap? And the other thing that's really important to say here is we mentioned earlier the gating criteria and the financial capability. The way the program is set up, again, with really good reason, is you can't just put in a bid and say, yeah, I'll solve that. It's fine. They're not allowed to sign off on a bidder saying, we'll make a plan. We don't have the money right now, but we're confident we can do it. You have to actually prove you can do it because the federal government has an interest in making sure this money doesn't go to fly-by-night organizations that have a funding gap they can't fill. So this is actually, if this scenario comes to pass, then in order for CUDs or other providers as well, but obviously I'm speaking on behalf of CUDs here, CUDs are going to need to come up with this gap funding in order to be able to participate. So that's where we're sitting.
Yeah.
So, Ellie, the legislature moved our policy towards these more public entities and CUDs because there were a lot of high cost areas and no ability to get them covered. I mean, the private providers were not covering them. So this is really worrying. And as you all have rightly noted, financial concerns are rising rapidly. Besides the obvious answer of, money, which seems pretty challenging to think about, are there other ways that the legislature could be helpful? We saw during COVID how critical this is. We know that it is rural and oftentimes poor communities that are not covered at this point. Feels pretty urgent, especially considering all the other things that we're seeing happening federally. Are there other things we could do besides the easy answer, which is not easy? To help you.
Only easy questions here. Rep Sibilia.
Yeah.
Easy questions only. I mean, the tricky thing about this is that there is no easy answer at the end of the day. And before I'll give myself a little bit of time to think here. But one of the other things is, as you mentioned, the areas that CDs are filling out, these are the areas that have been historically underserved. And why they've been underserved. Either there's a negative business case or the business case is marginal enough that it's not been interesting enough to the private sector when there's other areas of the country where they could be investing that are more profitable. And so the challenge with this, and this is why having a grant has been so important, starting with the ARPA grants under Act 71 and then looking at BEAD, is that if you're actually going to make this work economically, if you're funding this with debt and the interest rate is too high, it is not going to work. And so being able to have access to a low interest rates is critically important. So I mentioned earlier that we're shaking trees and having conversations. And so obviously understand that the state of Vermont does not have a ton of discretionary capital. However, anyone knows anyone, these are the kinds of conversations we want to be having is, is there access to philanthropic capital? Is there access to low cost financing from socially responsible funds? We are, again, working very closely with the VCBB to be exploring these options as rapidly as we can. So we have a contingency plan, but the more lines we have in the water, better. And if anything occurs to any, part of the reason we're here today is to explain our situation. And so I must turn that back on you. If you have any ideas about what you might be able to do, we will be all ears.
What do you think about that?
She's thinking.
I am thinking.
I do not have any of those ideas, other than working closely with our electric utilities and the access they have to the local. But I'm just wondering, of the 40,000 addresses that remain, how many of them do you or what percentage do you think are gonna hit easily a cap?
That depends on what they set the cap at. And
So
that's
have you
the problem.
done some scenario planning?
Well, so I can tell you this, that, those 3 states that had gotten through the award process, had basically gotten to 97 or 98% fiber coverage using the available funds that they had in the program. And so they were delighted with the outcome they got from their competitive bidding process. Small number of satellite terminals and mostly fiber to everything they wanted. And it was a slam dunk from their perspective when they finished those programs. They apparently received a request to say if the threshold was 2,500 or 5 or 75, what would it do to your program?
After having,
And so we don't know. And, honestly, I share that as an anecdotal piece of information. There's been huge pushback on the idea that you would go that low. And those states in particular said, we solved the problem. We did what we were supposed to do. This is successful. Why are you asking this question now? And obviously those are states that have some influence. So I think we need to wait and see. If the worst case scenario is it's a terribly low number. But I don't think that's realistic, or I should say, we have no reason to believe that's realistic. Does that make sense?
So but you can't remember that third state, so it was Nevada, Louisiana.
I know there are a couple more, but like Delaware's coming. Where?
West Virginia.
Maybe West Virginia. And there have been 2 or 3 more that have finished their bidding process, and I think they're like 20 or 5 or 30 that are open right now that are where Vermont is in terms of getting close to closing that. And everyone's kind of pressing forward again, from what we understand, because they've already put 2 years into this program.
So I have a question about sort of worst case scenarios and timing and the need to fill that funding gap. So we don't know when, everybody's explained, we don't know when things might change, weather seems likely, and what the changes are going to be. So how much time would we potentially have to try to drop back and make a new plan? And what's the brainstorming list of funding gap options? You mentioned a few, but so if there's an announcement tomorrow,
That'd be great.
Yeah. Well, it depends
Then
on.
we'd have something to react to.
Yeah.
Yes, but it also depends on the nature of the announcement, because I think the other unknown here, you've asked a very pertinent question. So we don't know when the changes will come. I think the best sense we have is maybe next month, but it could be sooner, it could be later. But that's my best estimate right now. But what we don't know is, given all the other commentary, both from us and then even from the Commerce Secretary Lefnick and Ariel Roth, who's the nominee to head the NTIA, is that the interest is to accelerate this program for many reasons, not the least of which is that it has taken a very long time to get to the point where we are now, and the current administration is, I think, quite rightly pointing fingers to the last administration for having taken all this time and not connected a single address for PD money. And so they want to be seen to come in here and move quickly. So if they implement a cap and they say, okay, great, now we don't want to slow the program down, so here's your cap, and you've already done your selection processes, you have 30 days. That's what I'm worried about, is that the mix of a sudden change combined with a desire to accelerate the program may mean that we need to come up with, we don't know the quantum of the gap right now, but if things go down in exactly that manner, we may need to move extremely rapidly. And that makes it very difficult, because if you're trying to talk to potential funders, you don't know if you're talking 40 million or 140 million. So fun times.
Digital funders. So this brainstorming list of how we fill that gap. So the obvious one would be an appropriation in the state budget, right? So I'm starting with the obvious thing would be that we appropriate something in the state budget, which feels unlikely. So
Correct.
That's easy, not likely. So what are other?
I'll take that.
Oh, please.
Yeah. There's So again, that's where it goes to the size of the gap. We're working on looking at low interest financing, leveraging other funds. We can leverage some remaining ARPA funds that we have to buy down interest. But even if you're paying, even with a zero interest loan, and you have to take on a payback, it could tank your business case. So it really depends on the size of the problem. If it's a small problem, we could probably come up with a solution. If it's a big problem, then we have to triage.
Yeah. And it's also not a one size fits all kind of story here, because there's different CDs, and different CDs have different situations in terms of where their balance sheet is and what the quantum would be and how much a cap would affect them. Again, I don't want to probably comment further because we might be getting specifics of individual lead applications, but that's something to consider as well. That's, we're obviously looking at this from the Vermont CUD Association standpoint of what does this mean for all of us, and what does this mean for Vermont strategy, but it would hit different CUDs differently.
So depending on where the cap is, you have because of the 20,000 plus or minus households that are left, you're going to have very different, I assume, correct me if I'm wrong, very different expense ratios on those projects, right? I mean, they're all expensive compared to downtown Burlington, but are those all within a narrow band of costs, or are they all over the place in terms of?
It's like anything. It's probably a bell curve where a large percentage of it is in that skin, the middle of the curve, right? And there's some real outliers at the top and the bottom that are high cost and low cost, right? And that, I don't know,
the middle of the curve is it within the range of the high cost minimums they're setting?
We don't know. I mean, we just don't know, and that's, I think it's hard to know. I think to answer your question, the CUDs are on a mission to connect those houses, whether they get funded with feeders. And the only thing is whether it's BEAD or some other grant or self-funding over the next 20 years, the CUDs are on a mission to get to those addresses, right? And so a lot of this is about optimizing the program as it exists when it's announced. And we've had a very collaborative relationship through the years. This bidding process makes that a little bit more complicated, but assuming the CUDs can get over the threshold of being competitive in that first round of bidding, then the rules allow negotiation. And so, I think what's unfortunate is this program looked pretty certain 3 months ago. We kind of knew what the rules were, and everyone was kind of working against those rules for the optimum, us and the competitors, of course, towards an optimum bid. What's a little strange now is the bid window is opening, it closes in 2 weeks. And then the rules are going to change. And so whether that, including possibly reopening the bid process at some future date or not, I mean, who knows? So I think the uncertainty is really hard. Again, as Director Hallquist said, yellow light, there's a lot of crazy stuff happening here. We're not pulling the fire alarm yet. It's not because we just don't know yet. It may be something we can live with. On the other extreme, it may be something that we don't want to live with. We just don't know. And hopefully all that comes to fruition before session's out. And you guys will be part of that. It's also possible that happens midsummer. We just don't know.
Silence descends upon the room. Rep. Bailey.
A couple of questions. The 40,702 that are remaining, how many of those do you think are these the worst case scenario ones, or are these how many of these are in that bell curve you said that you could just get in and get it done?
It's a much lower number than that actually, so this was the 2023 number. It came down again in 2024.
Yeah, we're down to 18,000 locations that need to get served.
And those are the most difficult ones?
Yeah.
They're pretty difficult.
We should clarify, there's more than 18,000 that don't have service. The delta between, I'm not sure where we were at the end of 24, but there's a number that they're funded. So there's funding available, and CUDs and others are busy building stuff. Yes, but there's existing funding.
I think we heard 20,000, of which 12,000 are in the Northeast Kingdom, something like that.
Yeah, that's
roughly.
That's yeah, which really answers your question, right? They're difficult to serve. Yeah.
Yes.
So how, Fidium's putting in all these cable in my district in the Lemoyle County area. They've been putting all that cable in. Is that BEAD funding or is that just on their own?
No, that's ARPA funds. Those were through this Lemoyle fiber network. But we funded partially. We funded about half of that.
And when this is all done, will the CUDs own all that? Own all the
CUDs own what was funded with what they funded.
Okay.
So in some of these partnerships, there may be a mix, but for some of the CDs, they own 100%.
And some don't. Yeah, right.
Yeah, the way it's set up is the parts that are grant funded, the CUDs own. So, and the parts that the ISP funded, they own. So that's what you guys might have.
Okay, and you'll be doing the billing. The ones that own the infrastructure will have the program.
They may use an agent to do the billing, but it's under the control of the CD.
There's different models of partnership. That's the traditional classic EC fiber model. Some of the ones that are partnered with Fidium does billing. It's run under the Fidium brand. And
doesn't Fidium own I'm in the Southern Vermont CUD, so I thought our deal was that Fidium owns the infrastructure. No,
they don't own they don't own the main line. They don't own exactly as Director Holku says, the grant funded portion of the main line is owned by the Communications Union District.
Okay.
And then portions they funded, for example, the connection from the main line to the customer house, if they fund that, they would own that.
Yeah, it's important to note though that those CUDs, for example, Southern Vermont, those CUDs are partnering with others. They do have an agreement that should that partner change, they have access to that, so in other words, they might be going through their network to get to their own portion, but they've got agreements with that. For example, Fidium to say, if you sell this off and you don't like the terms, we can still serve this area and reserve fiber to the main to get out to the world.
Yep. So anyway, just circling back, we wanted to, because noting the time, we want to come to summary. So I think we've been talking around this, but this is basically where we are. So Vermont has an existing fiber strategy under Act 71. Important to note that grantees under Act 71, which includes every communications union district, has a universal service obligation. And so BEAD is an important tool in the toolkit to be able to hit that universal service obligation, but that obligation remains regardless of what happens to this program, which is why it's so important to be able to capture as much money from that as we can, if we can. So yes, we are hoping that we're able to move forward with this program successfully and that it's not slowed down, but we are aware of the potential risks and are trying to do our best to make contingency plans in the face of all of this uncertainty. And exactly as Rob said, if something changes, then when something changes, we will know, and then we'll be able to start to take concrete action. And we can also circle back to this committee and give you guys an update and to be able to see if there's perhaps a more specific answer to Rep. Sebelia's question about what could be done.
Mm-hmm.
It's always very difficult to answer that question in the abstract when you don't actually know what the problem is. We're starting to get a sense of what the problem might be, but we just don't know.
All right. Thank you for being here. And committee, why don't we let's hop off live, Jack, and give the committee a